All right, so now we're at question number 32 on the ACT English test. Let's read the question. Given that all the following statements are true, again, here we don't have to assess if it's true or not. We can assume they're all true. Which one, if added here, if added where? If added right here. If added there would most likely introduce the topic of this paragraph. Okay, so really what's going on here is we have this 32 in a square. It lets us know that we want to add one of the sentences, F, G, H, or J, right before during. And one of these is going to effectively introduce the paragraph. So the real question is, what kind of information do we need to effectively introduce the topic of a paragraph? Well, if we're going to introduce the topic of a paragraph, we hope that it introduces the topic of the paragraph, right? It's just from this word introduce, so it has to introduce the topic. I know it seems pretty basic, but that's really the key ingredient here. So if ever you have to introduce the topic of a paragraph, figure out what the paragraph is talking about, and then make sure that first sentence introduces it. Now, sometimes you get questions where we have effectively transitions from the previous paragraph, right? Okay, so that's a different type of question. I just want you to be aware that there's two types going on here. One type would be effectively transitioning from the previous paragraph. That would be this one. And the type that we have here, which is effectively introduce the topic of this current paragraph. So just make sure that you're really clear on which one of these instructions you have before you move on and just assume you know what they're looking for. Okay. So in order to figure out what the topic is, why don't we read some information? Now, it's pretty variable to determine how much information you need to read. For the most part, you just need to read one or two sentences, but if that's not very helpful, you keep reading on until you figure it out. So during the formation process, tiny grains of calcium carbonate separated from the water. These grains built up, then compacted, forming the limestone that makes up the islands. Okay, so it looks like we're talking about some sort of a formation process during the formation process. So I need something that introduces that. And I know I'm talking about the islands, right? I mean, this whole thing is talking about the islands because that's what this passage is about. So I need something that introduces both of these concepts. We're going to introduce this paragraph as one that talks about the formation process and something about the islands because, you know, it's forming the islands and then the holes that are inside that people go and they dive down. So let's take a look. The Bahamas were formed from calcium carbonate, a component of seawater. Okay, well, that definitely talks about the islands, right? And it uses this word formed. And so that would necessarily lead into this. During the formation, right? The said formation from F. Okay, that works. Let's just read the other ones and see why they don't work. Calcium carbonate, a common rock substance, is also found in seawater. Okay, so that's related, right? Because calcium carbonate, and it mentions what it is, a common rock substance, is also found in seawater. You know, this word also here, or where does that come from? I mean, also with what? And so that's not really introducing anything. It's almost as if right in the middle of a paragraph. Also, it's not introducing this process of formation, or it's not even talking about the island. So it has a couple things going on there. Much of the land making up the Bahamas is still underwater. Well, that makes sense, and I can probably infer that, well, it's still underwater, and now I'm going into, during the formation process, tiny grains of calcium carbonate separated from the seawater. Maybe I can assume that, well, it's underwater, and because of this calcium carbonate separation, it's being built up, and, you know, it makes sense here. But there's so much inference going on there, right? It's not really introducing it. It just says much of the land making up the Bahamas is still underwater. So I do talk about the Bahamas, but I don't mention anything about the formation process. I didn't introduce any elements of the formation process, right? I don't have any calcium carbonate. I don't have any seawater. There's nothing formally connecting those 2 points together. It would just have to be a bunch of inference on my part. So that's not super effective. J, most types of limestone contain calcium carbonate, right? So that's probably true, and it even says all these are true, right? And I know over here I'm talking about calcium carbonate and seawater. So again, it's sort of loosely related, and I can assume that that has something to do with the grains building up, forming the island. But again, is that introducing this paragraph? Is it introducing the topic? No, it's not. It's not talking about the formation process. It's not introducing anything about the water, anything about the island. So J is going to have to be incorrect as well. And then you're left with F. Now, a good way to think about this is some of these answer choices aren't going to be so black and white in terms of, oh, well, this is wrong, as opposed to grammar, right? Punctuation. It's really easy to tell. Oh, we don't need a comma there. We need a semicolon there, something like that. But when it comes to questions like this, we want to think of it more of like a gray area. Okay, so we want the one that fits the best. And so you're not looking for this perfect fit, and this is a pretty perfect fit, but you don't want to limit it to that. You want to think of this as a spectrum and which one more effectively introduces the topic. And so we're going to look for little clues here and there in order to help us along the way. And answer choice F definitely accomplished this goal. Okay, so what did we learn today? We learned that there's two types of these effective introduction types of questions. One is effectively introduce the topic of this paragraph, and the other one would be effectively, instead of introduce, it would be transition from the previous paragraph. We treat it the same way, we just look for clues, right, within the sentence that we're looking for. And then from there, we figure out which answer choice would most effectively accomplish that goal. Thank you.